Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome back to Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and the latest that's coming out of Ottawa is that Canada's top military commander is warning the world is entering the most dangerous security era in decades. This comes as Canada's Chief of Defence Staff, General Jeannie Carignan, she's warning Canadians that the world has entered a more dangerous and unstable era, defined by what she says are great power rivalry between the United States and for Canada, for example, or what we're seeing with Israel and Iran, what we're seeing with Ukraine and Russia, but also the growing power of China itself when it comes to AI warfare, cyber attacks, Arctic militarization, and the global conflict escalating. She gave an interview to CBC, and essentially she said that this is a time where Canada must rapidly adapt because the post-Cold War security environment is over. She said that Canada must rapidly transform its military operations to prepare for what she describes as a very high-intensity conflict scenario, because she says NATO allies dramatically increasing their defense spending, and this is due to the growing instability linked to Russia, China, and the ongoing war in Iran, saying that Ottawa must accelerate military modernization and plan focus on drones, Arctic surveillance, and cyber defense, and AI-driven warfare systems. The general essentially says that Canada must prepare for a high-intensity conflict rather than what Canada's been known to do, which is peacekeeping, operations. Usually Canada sends its, army for peacekeeping missions. But she's saying that that needs to change, and this is due to, the lack of stabilization that we've experienced, and what is of this counter insurgency missions that has dominated the past 2 decades. So she's saying that these new threats are increasingly involved like drones, cyber warfare, AI-enabled attacks, space systems, long-range missiles, and Arctic security competition. So it's really a lot of escalatory language that we're hearing. And you have to guess, right? Because, for the longest time, the United States being the world's superpower, the world's greatest economy, but also having its military bases throughout the world and a lot of influence throughout the world, was essentially the country that would, be there to prevent certain, escalations taking place, right? Like, for example, this war in Iran, we know that, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had gone to all the previous U.S. administrations under previous presidents to get them to go to war with Iran. They all said no. But under President Trump, the war started with Iran, which President Trump doesn't know how to get out of. We're going to have the latest updates on that in just a few moments. So you have that's taken place, and then under President Biden, essentially this escalation that took place, and really not being able to do anything with Ukraine and Russia. And we could look into how that started, and now since 2022 to now 4 years later, still no end of that war. So essentially it looks like without having that nation that was essentially monitoring and being able to resolve conflicts, although start their own conflicts, it's a time in the world where all these nations are at a rapid pace militarizing themselves in terms of buying, when it comes to more ammunitions and fighter jets, and and when it comes to the defense spending, it's increasing. So this is where we're at now. And this is what the general is talking about, saying that Canada needs to change its ideologies when it comes to its role in the world and when it comes to Canada's sovereignty, and also where it's situated, right, with a not so friendly Trump administration to the south, and then you have the Arctic to the north, that Canada is strategically placed to increase its surveillance. So you have the Nato pressures, right, that are driving this massive military expansion. Canada just met its 2% of GDP mark after, spending 1.4% of GDP, way below the 2% that it had committed to by being a NATO member. And you have, the talks of it should really be 5% GDP in the next decade. Then there's the Arctic emerging as a central military front, right? Because you have Russia militarization, you have Chinese Arctic ambitions, you have this growing global competition on major long-term security risks and allies, new allies and old allies decoupling and new allies coupling. Ottawa is recently expanding some of those cooperations that we discussed, such as with the Nordic countries or with Greenland or NATO Arctic partners. But she's also saying that it's something that needs to be more increasingly when it comes to spending and when it comes to recruitment. And then she also pointed out, look at this Iran war that's essentially escalated, even though it was, a regional conflict. It's stemmed to international conflict in terms of when it comes to potential global inflation numbers, right? So, but this also highlights that this Iran war has intensified because of the energy security that's at risk, right? Globally in key markets in Pacific Asia. It's impacted, Europe, and we're seeing those increased prices at the gas stations here in Eastern Canada. So when it comes to what does it mean, right? When you look at this war that took place where the United States couldn't stop Iran, right? So what does that mean for missile warfare or drone attacks and align stability with specific countries? So the top general is pointing out that this is a time where Canada could potentially be called upon to defend Gulf allies from Iranian strikes. So far, it has not done so. And she also pointed out that the conflict has reinforced concerns inside NATO, saying that these future wars could spread rapidly across multiple regions simultaneously when, for example, you have proxy wars, right? Which is what Hezbollah war in southern Lebanon is with Israel, right? Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. So that was what she was pointing out to. And when it comes to AI warfare becoming a major strategic threat, saying that, you have, this AI is a big part when it comes to modern militaries increasingly relying on autonomous drones, right, to be able to find it in terms of in range and to be able to stop it. You have AI targeting systems. That's becoming more of what the defense strategy is. These cyber operations, satellite intelligence, and predictive battlefield systems, which, if you recall, that was part of the intelligence that China had been given to Iran during this conflict that's now on, day 81. But at the height of the conflict, with war with Iran, United States, and Israel, a lot of that, strategic information was given by China, and they have access to, some of these systems, right, to be able to detect it through AI. So now she's pointing out that this is an incredible time that over the next decade that Canada needs to really take a look at this and act, as AI is fundamentally reshaping the global military power over the next decade. Because and to that, when you look at the numbers, Canada is facing recruitment and readiness challenges, right? So despite the modernization plans, the Canadian Armed Forces continuously facing recruitment shortages, aging equipment because the investment dollars just wasn't there in the past decade, personnel retention issues, and the readiness concerns of the Canadian Armed Forces for some of these conflicts that are taking place. So now the military has struggled to meet its staffing targets following years of operational strain, and what we covered in the past many years in terms of the misconduct scandals and competition from the private sector. So this is a critical time. But when it comes to General Carrington, she says that this is a major historic milestone. So just a little bit about her. She's Canada's first female chief of defense staff. She is the first woman from combat arms background to reach the role, and she was previously commanded NATO mission in Iraq. Her appointment reflects a broader effort to modernize the military when it comes to military leadership, operational culture, and strategic planning. So that is part of her concerns that came out from her interview with the CBC. And there's been a leaked document. And this leaked Canadian Force document actually reveals plans that there might be major army modernization when it comes to including new tank battalions, rocket artillery, and Canada's first drone battalion. And so why does this matter? Because it reflects a major shift towards an AI era warfare, which is what the top general was talking about. Now, this modern military strategy is increasingly revolves around the drones, autonomous systems, long-range strike capabilities, AI targeting, and cyber warfare. And this is part of this bigger strategic trend that Canada is trying to prepare for when it comes to modern combat environments, such as the Arctic tensions we covered, and what it means of potential NATO restructuring that's taking place. Now, coming to what is happening in Parliament, on Parliament Hill, essentially a report came out on foreign-funded MP trips that continues despite lobbying rules that have changed. So essentially, foreign governments or lobbying groups and international organizations continue to fund travel for Canadian MPs despite a tighter lobbying and ethics rules that was introduced in the last recent years. Now, public disclosures show that Parliament MPs from multiple parties, so we're talking about Liberal, Conservatives, NDP, have accepted sponsored trips tied to countries including Israel, Taiwan, and India. And this is creating a time there. You have a picture of Conservative MPs there who were in Taiwan, and it's raising concerns because it's been subsidized trips, or the trips have been paid for by foreign agencies and foreign lobbying groups. So critics are saying that these practices raise really growing concerns about what it would mean as these MPs take these foreign trips, and will they have soft political influence on these MPs who are lawmakers for Canada, right? And what does it mean for the transparency in politics and governance when Canada is becoming increasingly a center for some of these things when it comes to debates and around defense, which we've been covering significantly when it comes to the one China policy and China saying, hey, back off on Taiwan, or Arctic security and international trade. So this started in terms of, really looking at is there political influence that's taking place from foreign entities on our MPs that we elect in our constituencies to send to Ottawa to represent the constituents and to be able to vote on laws that represent the Canadian population that they have been elected by. And and what does it mean when you have foreign lobbying efforts that pay for trips for MPs overseas? And is this going to create an issue where it's it's something that would be a conflict of interest? So this also raises questions on these sponsored travel trips, that will it have indirect political pressure on elected officials? So public ethics disclosure showed that MPs from multiple parties have continuously accepted sponsored travel, luxury accommodation, international conferences, and foreign-funded delegations. These destinations include Israel, Taiwan, India, Kenya, South Korea, Uzbekistan, France, and Italy. Sponsors include foreign governments, advocacy groups, lobbying organizations, business groups, and diaspora organizations. When it comes to Israel, Taiwan, these trips are raising particular attention when it comes to trips tied to those specific countries. Why? Well, when it comes to Taiwan, you got the China one China policy, and we've seen that take place with the criticism on China when Prime Minister Mark Carney went to go visit, saying that they don't take kindly to MPs visiting Taiwan. But when it comes to Israel, for example, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, CIJA, has sponsored multiple MP trips to Israel over the recent years. And when it comes to Taiwan, the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Canada has funded numerous MP visits to Taiwan during this tension with China and China's red lines that it's been drawing. So when it comes to lobbying rules, well, it's increased, but the changes haven't really fully stopped when it comes to practice, because Canada has tightened its lobbying and ethics rules in recent years to make sure that there's more transparency, there's reduced perception of conflict of interest, to have these MPs funded trips overseas when it comes to how they vote or the motions they vote or they put forward in Parliament when it comes to foreign affairs. And it requires more disclosures on their part. So this is at a time where a lot of things are moving quite fast, and essentially we want to know that our MPs are fully transparent and there isn't any pressure on them. You have the defense industry that when it comes to trips raising questions in the defense sector when it comes to sponsored travel. So if one example is Saab Canada funding travel connected to defense facilities in Sweden before lobbying MPs on procurement, defense policies, and industrial development. This also raised concerns when it comes to Canada, as it's currently reviewing its fighter jets, Arctic defense systems, naval procurement, and military modernization. So it really raises a question of conflict of interest, because those are taxpayer dollars that fund, defense spending. So what happens when you have lobbying groups that pay for MPs to go overseas and then lobby their government for those defense contracts? So massive issue on that, and that's why there's this transparency gap that Canadians are becoming more wary of. Now, going to this update on the US, Israel, and Iran conflict that is now at day 81. Well, we bring you the latest on what takes place from President Trump's post on Truth Social and what Iran says in the international arena or on Iranian state media. Well, Iran is now warning the United States and its allies that any renewed conflict could bring what Tehran calls many more surprises and potentially open new fronts beyond the current battlefield. What does that mean? That means, well, the current battlefield was Iran. When the height of the conflict was Iran essentially sending drone and missile attacks into Israel, as well as the GCC countries, such as UAE, Saudi Arabia, and so on and forth. So for it to say that it's going to expand, potentially open, their words, potentially open new fronts beyond the current battlefield. This warning comes as President Trump said to Iran that it just has days to reach a deal, that Washington or face renewed military action. This tension rises again, of course, during about the Strait of Hormuz. That's still not been resolved. It's, oil prices have gone through the roof, at $1.10 per barrel. And the energy shock internationally, the global markets have been reacting. And when it comes to diplomatic relations with other countries who are heavily impacted by this war, so this escalation could trigger a wider regional crisis after we've seen, the oil prices, inflation numbers. Canada's inflation numbers are up. U.S. inflation numbers are up. Canada's inflation numbers for April was 2.8%. The United States is at 3.8%. We're talking about shipping and international security that is at risk as well. So now this is, a warning from President Trump that things could escalate within the next 2 days, and Iran saying that this could open up a conflict in new fronts. So what does that mean? Does that mean new territory that's going to be hit as a consequence to increase the pressure on the United States? I think the world doesn't want to see this, right? So Tehran is saying that they've learned from the strikes that took place at the height of the conflict. Iranian officials are saying that the country has used the ceasefire period that started on April 8th. So we're talking about, a month and a half now to rebuild its military infrastructure, reposition its missile systems, strengthen core drone capabilities, and prepare for asymmetrical response on many different fronts. And this was by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, saying that any future attacks could trigger many more surprises, and that could potentially spread the conflict outside of the Middle East into maybe global energy routes or across allied networks, right? We know that Iran tried to close off through its proxies the Red Sea, which would be the other channel that Saudi Arabia exports its oil, given that the Strait of Hormuz was blocked. So this is, a huge warning that Iran may activate proxy wars, right? And through whether it's Hezbollah and other proxies, or what would be a cyber operation, maritime attacks, drone campaigns, and unconventional retaliation across multiple regions that hasn't been covered in the last, attacks that took place in most of March and the beginning of April. So analysts are fearing that the escalations could involve Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Gulf shipping routes, the Red Sea trade corridor, and possible targets outside of the region, as the Strait of Hormuz is still one of the strategic flashpoints here, as it still is 20% of the global oil supply. And to that, Iran continues exerting heavy control over tankers' movement in the Strait of Hormuz, but it selectively allows, vessels that have flags from China or India and South Korea, because they have negotiated arrangements with Iran. So that's taking place right now. So even temporary disruptions could trigger another inflation shock, and this is a time where we're going to see what it means on both sides. We know that President Trump said that he was going to back off and give some more time to come to a peace proposal with Iran, because the Gulf countries, want more diplomacy before another escalation. But Vice President J.D. Vance made the news because he said that the U.S. remains locked and loaded, essentially threatening Iran of potential escalations. And Vice President J.D. Vance was at the table for the peace negotiations, the one and only time where the two sides met in Pakistan, Islamabad, and a deal was not struck then. So it's interesting that for the vice president, who's been mostly against this war, is now making these comments of the United States is locked and loaded as a major threat of escalations, as Washington is continuously demanding long-term nuclear restrictions from Iran, missile limitations, and expanded oversight on Iranian military programs and nuclear programs. Now, Iran still is refusing major nuclear concessions when it comes to sanctions relief. They said that the latest peace proposal they sent to the United States is asking for sanctions relief, reparations for damages from the war, release of frozen Iranian funds, and U.S. troops withdrawal of the Strait of Hormuz and the Iranian ports, and the recognition of Iranian security control over the Strait of Hormuz. We showed you yesterday that they have now their own X account that's saying that they are the official authority. For anybody who wants to know what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, to check the X account. So Iran just, appointed themselves as the authority according to their X account. Tehran is saying that they will continue to resist permanent limits on uranium enrichment, which is a red line by the United States and Israel, and they will not dismantle their missile systems, which is another red line by Israel and the United States, or any major military concessions. So this leaves the negotiations extremely fragile. And we're going to see what this means when it comes to the Gulf countries, right? The GCC countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, who are pushing for diplomacy over renewed war because they take the major impact of the fallout of the war by being attacked, and they've had to restructure. They've had to pull out of a lot of their foreign investments. A lot of foreign investors pulled out of those countries, and it's a not a great time for the economies of those countries that had showed more stability, in the last few decades. So markets fear new inflation shock, if anything were to happen, and there would be increased war between the countries because the financial markets remain very nervous with a renewed conflict because it will push oil dramatically higher than what it is right now. It will worsen inflation and it will create pressure on central banks globally when it comes to the interest rate. So all markets are really taking a look when it comes to Wall Street. Well, the bond markets and central banks are increasingly treating the Iran war as a global economic threat, not just a regional conflict. And that shows from the trades and the strategies of what is being put forward. So this is, an incredible time as we're watching this conflict go on to 81 days with no end in sight. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.